In July 2016, I went on a vacation to South Africa. I was told a story that I didn't at first believe until I saw the photographs. As a kid, I have always been scared of sharks, even when swimming in pools where I knew a shark couldn't ever get you. At night, I always saw dark shadows and was scared a shark or other creature was somehow swimming with me. In my mind, I felt somehow a mad killer had taken a shark via a tank on a truck and put it into the pool I was swimming in. While I've read of people buying baby sharks and putting them in pools, nothing has happened that was ever as scary as what happened at Bokamoso Pillay. She was married to Kungawo Pillay, a millionaire property developer. She loved to swim, so much so that her husband built her an amazing Olympic-sized swimming pool in their home. Now, their home was stunning, a gargantuan mansion that overlooked the sea. Since South African waters are so shark-filled, he wanted her to swim safely. While visually stunning, on stormy nights, the waves would often crash over into the pool area. There was a barrier protecting the ocean from the pool, so no one ever considered that a shark could somehow get across. But somehow, when the waters were extremely rough during the day, a huge 10-foot shark was carried by wave into the Pillay's pool. Other shark experts speculate that the shark was actually able to jump across, although the wave-carrying theory seems most likely. That night, the sea had calmed, and everything seemed peaceful. The Pillays were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary, and both waded into the shallow end of the pool. Playfully, Bokamoso swam into the middle of the pool, unaware that they weren't alone. Lurking in the waters was a great white shark, nearly twice the length of her. Both Bokamoso and Kungawo were splashing around when, for a split second, Bokamoso disappeared under the water. As her head rose with a smile, suddenly the great white shark came from behind. It opened its mouth wide and pounced on her head. She had little chance as its teeth sank into her neck, ripping her head from her body. Kungawo swam to the shallow end steps and raced to a nearby cleaning net. While he tried to hit the shark with the pole, he could see amongst the blood that her lifeless body was already torn to shreds. He froze, taking in the horror swimming around in front of him. When the police came, they didn't know what to do. In fact, there was nothing they could do. But ultimately, on Kungawo's wishes, they left, leaving his home with the shark still swimming in his pool. There are a few conflicting accounts on what happened next. Some say he just let the shark swim around the pool until it starved to death. Others say that he had the pool drained and that the shark eventually suffocated. Either way, he made sure the shark died in a horrific fashion. No one fully knows how he killed the shark because a few weeks later, his body was found in the sea by the pool. Depressed and suicidal, he had tied weights to his ankles. He blamed himself for his wife's death and couldn't get over the guilt of building the swimming pool beside the ocean. In September 2017, the property was purchased by a famous hotel chain and has now been converted into a 5-star hotel. The swimming pool still exists by the ocean. No additional fencing or prevention has been initiated since the safety experts claim it was a freak occurrence. Next time you're going to swim in a pool, before diving in, just give it a quick look over. while finding a shark in there is near impossible, you don't want to be the one person, like Bokamoso, to get unlucky. This is a few weeks old, and after being lurked for some time, was not sure I should post this, as it is altogether a different theme. Still, I hope it serves as a warning to you all. Maybe it can save you. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in South Africa, and you may start to see this report come through on the news, or you may not. Apologies in advance. Typing with one arm is proving more difficult than I previously thought. I always thought I was lucky. I have always loved sharks. Living in the UK, brought up on a culture of sensationalized newspaper headings and Google searches, dozens of shark movies like Jaws, Deep Blue Sea, I preferred the more credible ones, made me well versed in shark attacks, a weird and often complete conversation stopper. So much so that throughout my early teens, I didn't really talk much about them. Just read the headlines and wanted to be a scuba diver, researching and learning about those magnificent species us humans have innate fear of. When I was 16, I learnt about a small tribe that used to build shark pools and gave a contender, a teenager, a stick with a shark tooth on it as a weapon, as a test of manhood. I read a fair bit about this, but facts and fiction are often blurred. I remember telling my parents and sister about these at dinner table. You can probably tell that I was not the most popular kid in school. That said, for my 17th birthday, my parents somehow found one of those teeth that had been used in these fighting pits. It was slightly discolored and about half a finger long. To me, it had meaning though, and I wore it wherever I went. It became symbolic, I guess, a present from my parents I never took off. Since then, I always had been lucky. Any time I was near the sea, there was always a shark sighting a few days after. One trip to Cornwall when I was 19, after I had finished a quick session of surfing before the inevitable clouds rolled in and it started raining, I had just gotten into my car with Josh, my best friend, and he spotted the tell-tale fin slicing through the water close to where we had been. I was in awe. I remember rushing out of my car and onto the beach. The fin stayed there for a few minutes and then disappeared. At that point in my life, I had decided to fulfill my dream. I was going to scuba dive with sharks. And not just any shark, but great whites. These occurrences happened. Most of the time I wouldn't notice, and there were no attacks. Exams came and went, and I found myself graduating with a decent degree. I knew it was time. Josh and I planned an excursion. I guess I dragged him along with me. He was also into them, though not as much as I. We headed up to the Cape Town 2 weeks ago, spent a few days doing touristy things, acclimatizing, eating lots, and soaking up the sun before the big day. Waking up at 6 a.m. to a boat on Dyer Island, a popular shark spot due to the seals that live on the island, was a sure way to get a sighting we wanted. Armed with our 2 GoPros and scuba gear, we did our pre-checks as always. Air, BCD, weights, fins, and so on. The dive cage looked sturdy enough, and the operator happened to be a seasoned veteran. Both of us felt comfortable as well as confident. At 10:30, we saw the first great white. It circled the boat, bumped against it to the screams and cheers from the rest of the tourists with us. Due to our booking slot, we were in the cage last, and had to watch as mums, dads, and their children all around the same age gingerly got into the shark cage and spent their 15 minutes looking, taking pictures, and coming out with awe and wonderment on their faces that I had wanted for so many years. At 13:15, it was our turn. We both did our body checks and hobbled over to the end of the boat. Josh got in first, moved to the side so I could get in. The shark cage was small. I'm 6'2", and there was barely enough room to submerge us completely. The bars were close together and strong, so you could, if you wanted to, put a hand out and touch a shark as it passed by. But only one gentleman did it, who had come every year for the past 10 years, something I was extremely jealous of. Regulators dropped down so that the people with their own gear could still dip below the surface of the choppy water and see these creatures properly, the water crystal clear with a visibility easily of 30 meters. I dropped in and gave the OK signal to Josh, and we went under. Looking up, we were only a few inches from the surface, and there was a decent headroom before the hatch we go in and out of. I made a mental note of how on earth I could get back out of it, considering I'm a big guy. And then I saw one, gliding towards the cage, mouth slightly open and full of teeth. It materialized into view, a true predator that no camera or phone can truly do justice to. I fiddled for my GoPro record button, looked at Josh, and he nodded that it was on. This particular great white was no baby. It must have been around 6 meters. I figured it was a female, as males rarely get that large. As it came closer to the cage, my heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but because I had finally accomplished my dream. Here I was, miles away from home, with my best friend and doing what I loved. Finally. At this point, I moved a little closer to the side of the cage. The fish had turned to parallel us. I shivered slightly as the water moved through my wetsuit, and I realized my necklace had ripped my wetsuit and was dangling out of a hole it had poked itself through. Annoyed, I looked up, first at Josh, who gave the OK signal, and went back to watching, hoping I had a few minutes longer before I was torn away from this place. As I looked around, there were a few smaller sharks nearby, but our big female had gone, disappearing into the depths. Happy, after a few more precious minutes, we resurfaced, signaling to the operators we were indeed happy. Then, disaster struck. The shearing of metal was the only thing I heard before I was dropped back into the water almost on top of Josh. I flipped over and realized their little bit of air between the surface and the cage had gone. I shoved my regulator back in and wildly looked around. The monster female glided past. My heart raced frantically as I looked around to see Josh staring above us. I looked, disbelief and panic coursing through every part of my being as I realized the cage was sinking. The cage was bent and buckled, and the hatch still wide open. I shot towards the hatch nonetheless, and closed it as best I could as the shark came in for another hit. Its eyes rolled over white as it slammed against the cage. We shot back against the wall of our cage, and our tanks were preventing us from moving too much as the shark's jaws opened and slammed into it. The cage went in a tumble. Dazed, confused, and petrified of what to do, we huddled together as the shark circled us, watching us with those black eyes. The cage hit the sea floor. We must have been 20 meters below the surface. The floor was sandy. We looked at each other, fear across both of our faces as the shark circled us tighter and tighter, watching, waiting. I looked around, hoping and praying that something was going to save us. Josh too watched the shark as its fins brushed the side of the cage. I had the unmistakable feeling that it was waiting for something. I grabbed Josh's air gauge and realized that in our panic, our breathing rhythm had gone, and we had barely any air left. That was when the shark came in once more. It crashed against the metal. The metal groaned and bent and buckled under the strain. I grabbed Josh and threw him against the side, my shoulder exposed to the razor-sharp teeth. I must admit I didn't feel it at first. In the state of panic and delirium, I briefly thought my dog had grabbed my arm and was vigorously shaking it. The shark then let go, and red filled the cage. The pain didn't register instantly, but when it did, it was blinding. I looked down to see the tattered remains of my upper arm. It had been bit to the bone, the flesh clinging and floating in the water resembling that of algae on a piece of driftwood. I used my good arm to pull myself away from the shark, who once again circled us, knowing that we had limited time. As the shark drifted off once more, and with Josh trying to keep watch of it, and me not trying to give in to the shock, I slipped my weight belt off me and used it as a makeshift tourniquet. Josh quickly realized and helped. It stemmed the blood flow enough. At this point, I thought my life was over. The shark seemed to have disappeared, given that our visibility was severely reduced due to the amount of blood in the water. Josh looked at me and made me go towards the hatch, which was by some miracle still working. He unclipped the hook and threw it open, peeking out to ensure that it was safe before we committed. We tore our weights off and deflated our BCDs in order to compensate for the lack of weights holding us down. Josh slid through the hatch and reached out to pull me through. Wincing in pain as my arm snagged on one of the buckled bars, my legs scraped against the metal, cutting deep. But then we were out of the cage. As we floated there desperately looking around, we started to feel the telltale signs of the sliver of air in our tanks. The shark had come back. It darted through the water, its powerful tail fins pushing it through. It came right at us, mouth open, its eyes rolled back. I pushed Josh out of the way, and its jaws enveloped me. Like a hot knife through butter, it cut deep into me and shook me and dragged me down to the ocean floor, away from the salvation and hope. In my desperation, I clung onto its snout, its beady eye looking straight into mine. My already bad arm hung useless out of its open mouth as it increased the pressure on my chest. I felt bones snap, lungs puncture and melt. I screamed. My regulator flew out of my mouth as blind panic set in. I groped towards its eye, hoping to put it off. I couldn't see Josh anymore. I couldn't see virtually anything through the red clouds of blood spiraling up to the surface. Then I got lucky. My dive tank had remained intact despite the force of the shark's bite on me. As the shark increased the pressure, the dive tank blew. The shark let me go and swam off, holding my last bit of breath, my BCD in tatters, blood pouring from so many places. I looked around, desperate to find Josh and get to the surface. I saw him then, below me. His regulator was out of his mouth, and his mask was drifting down. He had a confused expression, accompanied by a silent scream. His legs to the knee were missing. Tattered flesh remained, thighs twitching. He too was missing an arm, and the one that remained was pointing at me, as if he realized he could not reach the surface, and his last dying thought was related to why he couldn't move his legs. Everything started to go black. Through my decreasing vision and the feeling of weightlessness, I saw the shark once again circling me. At that point, something in me snapped. I wouldn't roll over and die. I kicked my legs, realizing that of all parts of me they still worked. The shark followed, biding its time oddly enough. I hit the halfway mark before it made its move. It swam straight towards me, cutting through the water, bit into my leg, cutting deep into the shin bone and thigh. It instantly let go and began circling again. I swam with my one good arm and one good leg. I broke the surface and screamed. Behind me, the fin reached the surface and started coming closer. I looked around and saw the boat. Tourists were crying and screaming for me to swim. The operators shouting at one another and the tattered remains of their winch system in the cage. I tried to swim, but couldn't. I was defeated at last. Low on blood and filled with far too much pain, I heard the roar behind me, and I figured it was the shark. After tormenting me for so long, it had come for one last time. I accepted this and closed my eyes. The next thing I knew is the feeling of sun on my face. People were hurriedly speaking, screams of pain and anguish. I opened my eyes to see the operator and the tourist, the one who had been jealous of me, working on me, stuffing me full of towels and applying pressure all over my body and telling people to stand back and not open my wetsuit. Then I blacked out. And here is where I woke up. After several operations, a week of intensive care, countless blood transfusions and stitches, missing several chunks of bone, skin and muscle, I sit here. When I first woke up, I saw Josh's parents first. Naturally and instinctively I asked where he was, but they cried, and then I realized. He was never going to come home with me. I slept after that, weak and exhausted. My dreams were filled with that shark, the way I had last seen my best friend, pointing at me, confusion etched onto his face as that picture is etched onto my brain. My parents and girlfriend flew in the next few days, and there was lots of crying, and after a few months of rehabilitation and skin grafts, I should be able to have full use of my limbs again. I was lucky, apparently. The diver operator came in with his crew and expressed their concern and were glad to see I was recovering. They apologized profusely and that it was a freak accident. I'm sure they were worried about an impending lawsuit. Josh's parents are due to come soon. They want to know what happened to their son, naturally. They know he has passed, but I guess they want absolute clarity. Some people do, I guess. I reached up to my necklace, hoping it would provide an ounce of comfort as it had so many times before, but I reached only to find it gone. I sighed, but deep down, I think I understood. Sharks never forget. I used to work with my friend as a marine biologist. I have never been afraid of the ocean, rather embraced it. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to become one, and a few years ago, that dream came true. But 2 years ago, I abandoned every piece of that dream when I discovered what really lived in the deep. I had been a marine biologist for 4 years, and I was 27 at the time. I had started working with my longtime friend Derek, who was also a marine biologist, but more specifically, he worked with a lot of sharks. I had specialized myself in smaller fish, like cods. We started working together after Derek had discovered increasing shark numbers in a small bay in San Francisco, a few miles from the city. He called me to ask if I was free to work on a project he'd started, and I happily agreed to work with him. I drove down to San Francisco and met up with him at a cafe. We hugged and talked a bit about our personal lives before he turned the subject to work. He told me about the increasing shark numbers and that he wanted to find out why. I disclosed that I wasn't a specialist in sharks, but he told me that he thought I could help him find out why. After finishing our drinks, we headed out. He had his top modern RV, and I had my Ford Raptor, and together we drove to the bay. We parked close to the beach and a jetty that had already been laid out. I didn't take more than half an hour before I spotted my first shark fin, cruising at the surface at a calm speed. I took my bag and headed for the RV, my home for the next few weeks. As I entered it, I was met by many different machines to measure water pressure, density and pollution levels, identification guides, and electric devices that I didn't know what they were. Derek entered the RV as I placed my bag on the left bed. He told me to settle in and went to the small kitchen and turned on the water boiler. I asked about the devices, and he told me what they were and what they were used for. That was about the first day, just getting to grips with everything. I went to bed early and got up in time in the morning. The following day, we started our lengthy task of tagging sharks. We tagged 6 sharks the whole day and must have seen another 15 of them. Like Derek had told me, there were a lot of sharks. We kept doing this the entire week, whilst doing some other tasks here and there, like measuring the water levels and doing tests on local fish. After 2 weeks, we had tagged over 20 sharks, mostly makos, but we saw 1 or 2 great whites swimming through. We saw decreased levels of fish, mostly cods, but it was most likely because of the raised shark population. Then, 2.5 weeks into our research, strange things started happening. Even though the shark levels hadn't increased, more and more fish were disappearing. We shrugged it off as an increase in the shark's appetite, but that isn't very common. Truth be told, we didn't have a clue what was going on. Then, 2 days later, more than 10 sharks had disappeared from the marked area, which, for your information, was a 3-kilometer diameter. This was very sudden. The day before, there were still about 25 sharks in our marked area. Again, not a clue could be found as to why that happened. They just disappeared. When we measured fish levels, it showed that 85% of the fish that we found here the first week had disappeared. Now, this was strange, so we called around amongst other biologists, and 3 offered to come down to help us. We, of course, accepted the offer, and the next day 2 of them arrived. The last one arrived 2 days later. We started to show them our information that we had gathered, and they too agreed to this being very strange. The only explanation we could figure out was that the sharks had returned to the deeper ocean to breed, but the fish levels still baffled us. We were all clueless. Then, the 4th day after the last biologist arrived, all of the sharks had disappeared overnight. We stood with our mouths gaping wide, not knowing what had happened at all. At this point, we decided to bring out our diving gear and examine the bottom of the seafloor. Until now, we had spent all our time on the surface, but we needed to venture down into the sea to find answers. The only thing we knew about this bay was that it sloped steeply and quickly, meaning it got deep just a few meters out. It took a day for me and Derek to go to town and rent some diving gear. We rented 3 full sets and returned to the bay. Next day, we ate breakfast and suited up, me and Derek and one of the biologists, Clark. We hopped into the boat operated by the other biologists. We drove out about 30 meters, where me and Clark hopped into the water first. Derek had to readjust his oxygen mask and tank, and didn't get in until 5 minutes after us. We all descended together, and the seafloor was about 20 meters down. When we reached the seafloor, we immediately noticed the empty water around us. A few cods here and there, but nothing else. The wildlife in the bay had diminished to a minimal amount. Me and Derek started to swim a bit further out, and Clark swam the other direction, keeping within communication distance. It was all the same for 15 minutes. We didn't find anything, and neither did Clark. No answers to where all the sharks and fish had gone. Then, a great white came out of nowhere and swam past us 2 meters away. We looked at it in horror, because trailing the shark was a line of blood that led back to a long slash wound in the shark's side. It was deep and traveled along almost the whole shark. Then the shark slowed down and sank to the bottom. It had died because of the blood loss. We moved closer to inspect it, but there was only one thing we thought about in that moment. What had caused this wound? No shark did this. We wanted to believe that the shark had cut itself on a wreck, or perhaps on a rock. But this was too deep, too long a gash to be caused by a simple rock. We tried to reach Clark, but no answer came. We tried again. Still silence. Derek was the first to break silence between us. He told me that he had to return to the boat, that something down here was wrong. I agreed 100%. We swam as fast as we could, but when we started ascending under the boat, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down. It was Clark. His suit was ripped, and he was bleeding a lot. He looked at me with fear in his eyes, and within a blink of an eye, he was dragged into the dark sea beneath us. I didn't make a sound. I couldn't move. I was frozen. Then I almost screamed as Derek grabbed my shoulder to talk to me. He started to swim upwards, holding my arm tightly. I couldn't move, and underneath me, something came out of the dark. It was a human-like, gigantic creature, but it didn't have legs. It had only a fin, like a mermaid. But the thing I cannot forget was its face, or the face that wasn't there. Where a face should have been, there was just a mouth, with 100 small, sharp teeth in a row, and they were covered in blood. Clark's blood. And its arms. Where there should have been hands, there were just 3 long claws. The worst thing was, as it looked at me, it smiled. I started to scream, and the creature swam towards me with incredible speed. It grabbed my leg, digging 2 of its claws into my leg. I couldn't make a sound, and like that, it started to drag me down into the deep. I thought I was going to die. Then, out of nowhere, Derek came back and kicked the creature in the face, making it retreat and release me. Derek grabbed me and started to pull me up again, and then I could see his face. In a second, it turned from blank to horror. He was pulled down, and I passed out. I didn't wake up until I was in an ambulance. Next to me sat an EMT, calmly looking at me. I asked where Derek was, but he just looked at me with sad eyes. I understood it all. Later, in my hospital bed, I asked one of the biologists who had been on the boat what had happened. She told me that all she knew was that Derek had gotten to the surface, but instantly dove back into the depths for me. He never surfaced again. Instead, my unconscious body floated up, and they pulled me into the boat and drove back to shore. I still don't know what happened down there, but I know that Derek died for a reason that I still don't understand. But whatever creature lived down there, if it's still there or not, I don't know. But I can tell you, stay away. I live in the forests of Wisconsin now, far away from the ocean. They had to amputate my leg because of the extensive damage those claws had caused. The doctors can't explain what had happened, and I wasn't going to tell them. Clark and Derek had died because of our curiosity, and I lost my leg. The one who knows the truth is my dog and the other two biologists. But something inhuman lived down there, in reach for civilians that wanted to take a nice Sunday swim. But don't. The bay doesn't have a proper name, but some call it Shark Bay. If you ever hear of Shark Bay in San Francisco, don't even think about going down there. I would return to kill that thing if I dared, but what I experienced hinders me from allowing that thought. Please, whatever you do, do not go into the water in Shark Bay. Final note. I would like to tell you that I have kept the biologists' names disclosed in respect. Clark is not the biologist's real name. Derek is my friend's name, but I ask that you not Google his name, nor try to find out mine or the other biologists. It's been a hard time for all of us, and I do not wish to be reminded further of the events. When I was 9, my older brother Corey was 11. When I was asleep, my older brother would sit and lie awake. I know because sometimes I'd wake up at night to see him staring at the plastic glow-in-the-dark stars that peppered the ceiling of our shared bedroom, or using the orange glow cast from our nightlight to make poorly formed mutant shadow puppets on the wall in front of our beds. His 2-year seniority put his maturity and understanding of the world far above my own. It's funny how when you're so young, just a couple of years can make such a difference. It's also kind of scary how much stress you can accumulate as a kid. Stress from something like seeing your parents get divorced, and how naive adults can be to it. I don't think we hide it well. I think adults just forget the complexity of a child's mind. If I had to guess, that's probably what kept Corey awake at night. I remember it was August, and my pajamas were sticking to me and my forehead felt damp with sweat. I woke up to my brother's hushed voice. Maybe I woke up mid-sentence, or maybe it just took a minute for the blur to subside and my brain to adjust to any sort of outside stimuli. And sometimes it dips and I think it's gone, but then I see it again behind the bed or coming out of the closet. Huh? See what? What are you talking about? It's a shark fin. Then I saw it. It was a kind of curved triangle, jagged in places. A shadow on the wall that peaked less than 3 or 4 feet above the floor, bobbing slightly and moving slowly towards the corner of the room. It took me a second to peel my tongue off the roof of my dry mouth before I could respond again. It's just a shadow. It's probably a car passing by or something. Corey took a little while to reply, but when he did, his voice wavered. No, I've been watching it. It's something else. Something really weird. The fin ducked down and disappeared from our sight. I remember feeling a bit dissatisfied that it was gone, as I was still trying to figure it out. I wasn't afraid of it. It was just interesting. I adjusted my body and put an arm under the back of my pillow and glanced over at Corey as he relaxed from the kneeling position he'd been in. He looked nervous, but I think he felt better knowing I wasn't as concerned and was ready to fall back to sleep. Corey gripped the edge of his blanket, ready to pull forward his covers when something more frightening happened. My bedpost screeched a few inches across the hardwood. I yelped as we both shot up, gripping our covers and kneeling in our beds. My heart was racing, and my head scanned the room, looking for the shadow. The shark fin circled around the room before dipping again into the bottom of the wall. I wish I could tell you what my brother saw. I wish I could tell you what my brother was saying. I heard his voice, but I didn't hear the words. The blood was rushing through my head like an air raid siren. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even think. This is what sheer terror feels like. My head whipped around the room, looking for the shadow, and I gripped the sheets on my bed. Corey let out a hushed shout that brought me back into the world that wasn't spinning confusion. Dude, what do we do? I don't know, but we have to... Suddenly, the bottom of my twin mattress bowed inward, hard and fast, enough to bounce my entire bed frame off the ground. It felt like my chest was caving in, and every ounce of air left my lungs in a silent burst of terror. I used to have nightmares where I'd be so afraid of an unseen force that I'd scream until my lungs were shredded in my chest, but I could never let out more than a whimper. I would scream until my face was on fire and my body trembled, but nothing would ever come out. This was a nightmare, a surrealist nightmare that blurred reality. Corey's experience was different, but he didn't have the luxury of not knowing if this was real or not. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew something was happening. Something really bad. Something wrong. As an adult, I've heard so many people tell me that they prefer the horror movies with slashers and serial killers, because those things actually happen, you know. What they can never understand is the true incomprehensible horror of witnessing something that can't happen, but is happening. We waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the shark fin circle our room. Our bodies clenched as we braced ourselves every time we watched it dive into the floor, only to surface again and continue its predatory pace. Corey broke the silence, but not with words. He tossed his pillow into the center of the room, and we waited to see if anything happened. It sat there as any would on the hardwood floor. Whatever we expected to happen didn't. We laid there silently as the stars on the ceiling turned to white, and the sun peeked through the curtains, and the shadows faded away. Down the hall I heard our mom, her slippers shuffling down the hallway and snapping against her heels. Her knees cracked, and she groaned and mumbled into the telephone as Corey and I locked eyes. I'm not sure if he looked relieved or even more terrified. He almost looked confused. The door creaked open, and I heard our mother shoulder the phone as she began to enter the room. Her voice was as defeated and tired as I'm sure mine sounds now. "Boys, it's 9. You gotta start." She lumbered forward into the room, and her foot dipped below the surface before she disappeared into the floorboards. She never made a sound. She was just gone. We watched as crimson red bubbled to the top of the wooden floor. I'm not important. I'm just me. There is nothing special about me. There is no reason I should have seen this, but I did. Every moment of my life could be dissected, and no thread would trace to what happened today. It was random, and that is the worst part of it all. It could have been anyone else, but it wasn't. I was at the mall in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I had the day off from work and decided to spend some money. I ate lunch, drank a bunch of soda. I walked around more. Then I had to use the restroom. I was closest to the one by FYE, which requires walking a couple dozen feet down a hallway. There weren't many people at the mall today. I was not surprised to be the only one relieving myself, especially in the less popular restroom so far from the food court. When I exited the bathroom, another was walking down the hall. Another. It walked like a person. It was wearing a hoodie and jeans. It was looking downward. I thought it was a man. Within seconds, I was close to passing by it. Then it looked up. My mind did not fully register what I was seeing on its face. Its eyes were a deep black and separated by a wide gap, with small nostrils located almost where a normal man's mouth should be. There was no visible chin, just blank white skin. Near the top of its neck was a long, narrow mouth, a single row of teeth on the top and bottom lips. It was behind me now, and I was still walking forward, stunned by what I first assumed was a massive physical deformity. I chose to glance over my shoulder, out of instinct and shock. It had stopped walking. It had turned around and was staring at me. Its arms drooped to its sides, and it opened its mouth slightly. A stench filled the hallway, flipping my stomach over. I stopped myself from vomiting and tumbled out into the open sitting area. A man was sipping from the water fountain on my left. He noticed my stumble and asked if I was all right. I motioned breathlessly to the hall. The man was clearly puzzled, and he leaned over to look down the hall. He stared only for a few seconds, unmoved. Then he turned back to me. He looked sad in a way and nodded slowly. I figured that for some reason I had hallucinated, and that this man thought I was insane. I looked back down toward the restroom. I shouted fearfully, seeing that it was still standing there, but closer. I looked back at the man next to me, who kept nodding as he slowly walked back out into the main section of the mall. What is it? What is it? I cried, not caring if I caused a scene. The awful smell was growing worse, and I heard footsteps coming from the hall. I ran out into the parking lot. My car was parked on the complete opposite side of the mall. I power walked all the way around the building, carefully looking over my shoulder the whole way. I sat in the nearby Barnes & Noble for hours. I stayed in the cafe, among plenty of other people. My mind was racing for an answer. I still haven't found one. I don't understand what I saw, or what the man was nodding at. I do not understand anything. I am afraid. If I ever smell that scent again, the bloody, filthy, decaying scent, I will not survive it, in one way or another. I would be lying if I told you that I did not fear the window of my bedroom when I was lying in bed in the darkest hours of the night. I can confirm it was just over a month ago when I had an experience that changed my life forever. Even today, I keep my window barred with a steel pipe, and my wife, who I married before these events, still finds my fears unreasonable. But I know what I saw. I know what I did. Yet I do not know who or what I did it to. It began at 3 in the morning, last April. I had burned through several sleeping pills, but could not yet find a single hint of the urge to sleep. The night was silent and grim in an almost unnatural sense that I had never experienced before in my life. From across my bed where I was lying, I stared out of my window into the forest behind my peaceful country house. The moon was hanging low that night, casting a haunting silhouette of light over the tall pine trees that silhouetted onto my bedroom floor. From between those trees is where I saw a dark, shadowy figure emerge. He was cloaked in black clothing, and at first I thought I had imagined it. I continued staring and soon found myself growing tired for some reason, likely because the sleeping pills were finally kicking in after I had overdosed several times already. My wife believes firmly that my experience was a mere side effect of the overdose, although I know she is wrong. I closed my eyes tightly and tried my hardest to sleep, and I did, but only for a few minutes, when I was awakened by the sound of a knocking on my window. I opened my eyes and almost passed out right there and then. There was a thin, pale-faced man at my window, waving a bloody kitchen knife back and forth in a taunting motion. He opened his mouth, revealing 2 rows of sharp, pointy, shark-like teeth. This brought to mind what I had seen on the news just a few days earlier. The Shark Man from the local circus had gone missing after the murder of his mother. I had seen them once before with my family when we went to the circus, and I remember having several nightmares after the show. My father had reassured me that they were simply normal people just wearing an elaborate mask, and for a time I had believed him. But this experience proved him wrong. I suddenly stood up, and the man at my window slammed his fist into the glass, shattering it. I ran to my bedroom door, which led into the hallway, just as the man punched through the glass several times and began stepping through the window. I saw his left hand, bloodied with pieces of torn skin hanging from his wounded fingers as I ran out of the room and into the bathroom in an attempt to hide from the Shark Man. I crawled into the tub and hid behind the shower curtains. I heard footsteps from outside the bathroom, and I instinctively held my breath. My heart was pounding, feeling as it would burst out of my chest. I heard the footsteps draw nearer and realized that I had forgotten to lock the bathroom door. I slowly and quietly stood up and reached for the door when the Shark Man opened it and suddenly smiled terribly, again displaying his unnatural teeth. I slumped backwards, falling hard into the bathtub. The Shark Man rushed forwards towards me, and I kicked him in the stomach while I laid there in the tub. I sat up and desperately grabbed at the toilet plunger that was lying on the ground and began beating the Shark Man with it. He fell to the ground, and the handle of the plunger cracked in 2 pieces after I hit his head with it brutally. He was lying on the cold bathroom tile, the dark red blood dripping from his mouth and forming a puddle on the ground. I saw him move his head in an attempt to stand up, and I grabbed the knife he had dropped and slit his throat to kill him. I took a deep breath and later proceeded to clean up the blood once I had returned to my senses. I then dragged the body out of the house and carried it off to the forest behind my yard, where I buried the body in an attempt to hide it. It was a week later that I got around to replacing my window, and after that, I met my wife, who repeatedly denies this story every time I tell her. She tells me to forget about it, and maybe I should, but the mental scars are still there. 1 month later. My wife is dead. I am both heartbroken and confused about what happened, so let me explain. I had walked into my bedroom. I saw a woman standing there with a thin, pale face and those same shark teeth that the shark man had. I stood frozen, not believing what I had seen.
There is only one true shark person. The shark man was my brother.
She shook her head slowly.
You killed my brother, and I'm tired of hearing the story over and over again. I thought that I could have forgiven you for that, for what you did, but I was wrong.
She held one hand behind her back the entire time she spoke, and now she revealed that it was a knife that she was holding in her hand. She charged at me, and I grabbed her hand before she could stab me. I threw her to the ground and sat on top of her to pin her down, since she was weaker and smaller than I was. She grabbed the knife from the floor and quickly stabbed it into my left shoulder. I cried out in pain and fell onto my back. The shark woman climbed on top of me then and tried to stab me once more, but I blocked the attack, punching the shark woman brutally in the face. That one strike was enough to knock her to the ground, and I picked up the knife and slit her throat as I had done with the shark man. But something was different. Her face itself felt as if it was made of rubber, and my knife got caught between it. As I pulled away the knife, I found that pale face to be a mask. With my hand shaking, I pulled that horrid mask off the woman's face and saw that she was my wife.